this is a really great topic, so I wanted to jump in. So I think, as you guys all know, the degree payoff, as we're interpreting it up here, is a provocative question for this panel, which is the way the students and parents kind of choose their college education, is it all wrong? Is everyone doing it wrong? It's safe to say, I think the typical behavior for a lot of people is like focusing on choosing the right college, and there's a lot of angst in that process for a lot of people, and a lot of articles in the mainstream press, and a lot of data and US News reward reports and a bunch of copycat reports that all talk about getting that choice right. But what if there's another variable that's even more important? What if the future of a student's kind of career path and success is much more defined by what major they choose and other things about what happens at their academic choices than the school? So I think that's the kind of big question that animates the beginning. But as you'll see from as we get into this, it actually raises kind of interesting big questions about other things that we think about, how we think about credentials and degrees, and are we doing it right, which is always a fun question. I'm Jeff Young. I'm a journalist and been covering this space for a long time. I'm now with EdSurge and was at the Chronicle of Higher Ed a long time before that. But today I wanted to first off just tell you who's up here. Very briefly, I'm not going to get deep into the bios of people. In fact, I asked everyone to give me a fun fact that's not on their LinkedIn profile. So let me tell you who the panelists are. And also, just the format is going to be very informal. There's not going to be formal presentations. I'm just going to kind of start off asking questions of our panelists and leave time for y'all to ask questions. So please do be thinking now about what you'll want to present or ask to the panel. So first off, who we have up here? Matt Boyce is Director of Undergraduate. So I'm going to go, as you can see their names on the small enough room. I'm going to start with Matt and go down the line. Matt Boyce is Director of Undergrad Admissions at George Mason University. So he brings that enrollment professionals' perspective from a major institution. And now he almost didn't do this job. He was really touch and go there. He might have been a Major League Soccer player, which he loves to watch as a fan, but also tried out for at some point, which is his fun fact here. We're glad you're here today, although maybe we can have a pickup soccer game later. I don't think I'll be up for it. But Terry Flannery is from American University. She is the executive director of university communications, and she is very involved with marketing there, obviously, and they have a lot of marketing campaigns. Of course, those of us who live in Washington, D.C. here see these and live and breathe these. Her fun fact is actually related to something she's contributed in her professional career, which is if you've ever gone to she's a Washington Nats fan, the baseball team here, and if you've ever gone to the ballpark, you'll see that the very great campaign that AU has, American Wonk, is there, and it's no spelled backwards is wonk, which I never noticed until being at the ballpark. So that is something she's able to meld she's making a difference at the ballpark while she's there watching the game. So Mark Schneider is a vice president and institute fellow at the American Institutes of Research. This group has a tool that's very relevant to this discussion today called College Measures, which we'll talk about a little bit. Lets people see which academic credentials give the most return on investment and payoff. Now he has one that really, I'm almost like, this is more of a teaser and we can get into this later, so stay tuned for the answers to what we're talking about. But he did have a gig very briefly, the statute of limitations are up, in the mafia. So wonder about that for now. But that was an exploration of career decisions. Last but not least is Marty Vanderwerff, who I actually can say I was excited. I got to work with at the Chronicle when we were both reporters at the Chronicle of Higher Ed. Now he is now Associate Director of Editorial and Post-Secondary Policy at Georgetown University's Center on Education and the Workforce. A center you guys all know really well. I wanted to make sure I looked down and didn't get the words wrong just because I'm nervous, but this is a big deal organization where he's tracking these trends in career. And so his fun fact is that some of his early also exploratory jobs, first couple, ended with maybe getting fired a little bit from things like busboy and very important jobs. But I'm sure that was all very good career preparation for understanding the workforce deeply. So anyway, we have very much personal professional expertise up here for everybody. And I did want to start with a question about, with Terry actually, and a tool that I didn't mention in the intro, but it really is kind of something I really want to start with something American University does that I think is still pretty unusual, which is to have a website at AU where you guys track very closely like how your graduates are doing in employment after, after those first 6 months, is it? After 6 months you survey them. Do you have a job? Is it in your related field? And you make all that very available to the public, to potential other students and parents, and you just put it out there as to say like, so people who major, and you can break it down by major. So you can sit there and do a drop down of like all the people who graduated with majors in art history, how'd they do? What percentage of them have real jobs? So can you talk a little bit first about how, how that came about? And I understand it wasn't everyone loved this idea at the beginning when you guys were thinking of it, like that you had some resistance. So could you talk about how that website came about and whether there was maybe some pushback?
Sure. Thank you, Jeff. So at American University, I serve currently as Vice President for Communications and Marketing. And I recognized an area of differentiation that American University has, which is that it has a tremendously high knowledge rate for response to the survey that we all do, which is first destination, graduation census. Many of you do a survey. Yes, you're shaking your head. Where are you within 6 months of graduation? And that survey happens through an orchestrated approach with lots of my colleagues, including Gihan Fernandez, who's just walked into the room, who's our executive director of our Career Center. And he and I and another colleague from our Office of Institutional Research realized that we had this unbelievable asset that was more powerful, more accurate, and could tell better stories and answers to questions than anything else that was out there. Far more accurate than pay scale, far more accurate than anything on LinkedIn, which are voluntary and very small samples relative to the size of your alumni, especially recent. So we have an 80% or so knowledge rate for every one of those graduation census. So we decided to take the data and present them for the last 4 years, four most recent years. You can look at it now if you have Wi-Fi. Just search "We Know Success." No. Wonk, no, get that connection. And you'll be able to search by degree, program, and level for every program at the university. There are a couple, in all honesty, that we don't have enough data to present. So if it's a new program and it doesn't have at least 5 graduates yet, we're not presenting data because it can be misleading. So you can look at the overall stats or information that many universities present on a university-wide level, sometimes based on a much lower response rate. But for 80% of our graduates, we can tell you overall that 91% of the university's undergraduates are employed in grad school or both. But you can go down and search at the level of an accounting major versus a literature major. You can look at a master's degree candidate in a program. You can look at any number of sort of cuts, and then you can look at not only are they employed, but you can look at where they're employed, in what sector, and down to the level of employer. So we list each one. You can look at the income range, so you can see salaries, starting salaries for each of those majors, which starts to get to the point where people get a little scared, right? And then things like what kinds of experiences contributed to these outcomes, so where they interned and where they studied abroad by degree, program, and level. So it's really powerful data. It tells a story that you can't replicate with sort of broad messages, and helps people answer the question about the economic return for majors they might be considering.
Can I throw in a couple data from searching this morning?
Sure.
So I was curious, right? Like if you guys are logging on, you're probably doing the same thing I was doing, which is so art history, right? That's the one where your parents would tell you not to do it. 95% had jobs. So that's a pretty high number. Arab studies, this one is the one I found that has 100% employment. Philosophy, I'm just curious, people you can think what you think that would be. Philosophy was 86%. Yeah. And anthropology was the lowest that I could find, although I didn't do every one of the drop tabs, which is 74%.
Right.
Is that one of the lower ones? Did
It
I
is. I think
did I
it's
strike upon?
the lowest right now.
And so how do you feel if you're an anthropology professor? I mean, did you have pushback from certain departments about worrying about losing the game that I'm just playing here?
Well, when we talked to the deans about doing this at first, they said, "You want a what? You want a huh?"
This is part of why more of you aren't copying this idea, probably.
But we showed them how it was much better than what was out there about the representation of the university's economic value. And that what we could do was help people understand that story in more detail that could then be filled in with other details. And certainly there were people who were concerned about their rate being lower relative to other majors. And certainly there were faculty and department chairs and deans who thought that we might be driving decisions about major based on what the return was. But in most cases, the results that you see are higher than you're imagining in your mind based on the stories you hear about the anthropology major in the Starbucks. And Gihan's in the room, yes.
Hi,
Go for it.
at AU, and I head the Career Center, and we really partnered on this wonderful.
Sir, will you take the mic, sir?
Yes, so I'm Gihan Fernando, and I'm at American University also. I head the Career Center there, and we partnered on this effort. And just to add into the comment that you had, anthropology specifically, so we did get calls, right? But the thing that was interesting to me was that it worked as incentive for the departments to work more with the Career Center. That's been the result. It has not been kind of like we can't do this, right? So just the other night we did a big program which largely the anthropology department organized, bringing in their graduates and who are doing interesting things in the world, and it was very well attended by the students in the program. And that is the kind of thing that's worked well. The other result that we were kind of surprised, and it also has really contributed to our knowledge rate, is that a lot of the calls I got from departments were like, that's wrong, it's not 74%, it's actually closer to 100% for our graduates. And I was like, that's great, you have that information, please share it with Terry and myself, right? So that we can include that in the data that we're gathering.
Yeah.
So
Great.
that, on both those fronts, it's worked very well in positive incentivization.
It is amazing when you surface that data to the public Okay, so I want to keep moving through everybody here because we have so many interesting people up here. I don't want to give anyone less time. So I wanted to talk, Mark, about college measures. If you could describe a little bit about that tool, because I think it's a little bit related and it gets at this question. And I guess maybe the first question is, this tool that you have, which is keeping score on the ROI of majors, is the premise of this panel right? Is the major more important than the institution in your view, from your data?
Yes, so imagine the AU tool on steroids, okay? Imagine every public institution in a state, including community colleges, four-year schools, graduate programs. Imagine certificates. Imagine any program that is granted by mostly public institutions. In the state of Minnesota, we have both not-for-profit and for-profit schools. In the state of Virginia, we have all the not-for-profit schools. So imagine data on the outcomes, the wage outcomes of graduates from every single one of those programs in every single university, every single community college in the state. That's what we have. And what we do is we don't rely on surveys, we rely on administrative data. So states merge their college transcript data, essentially very simple data about, and it could be more complicated, but what we have is the data on the school, the program, the year of graduation, merged with UI wage data. So everybody knows there are limits with the UI wage data. We could talk about those. And for flagship universities and for PhDs, it really the match rates start getting fairly low, maybe 70%. But for community colleges, our match rate, finding people in the workforce, it could be as much as 85 to 90%. And we have wage data for 1, 3, 5, 8, and 10 years later. So we actually can project from that because earnings trajectory are pretty well known, so we could actually project, we do project 20-year lifespans, work lifespans, wages, total wages over 20 years. We then do ROI calculations. So just to summarize the handful of really important lessons. So except for, you know, the really prestigious schools, what you study is way more important than where you study it. So if you get a degree in fine arts, I don't care where you got your degree from fine arts, you're going to be at the bottom of the pay scale. That's going to happen at 1 year, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years later. In fact, there are degrees, master's degrees, that 10 years after completion, the average wage is lower than the average associate's degree. Right? Think about that. So number one, what you study is more important than where you study. Now this may be backwards looking, right? Because I mean, this whole conference and other conferences, like degrees don't matter. You know, we're going to find alternate ways of certifying people. So the fact that you have a certificate or an associate's degree or bachelor's degree someday may disappear. 5 to 10 years, everything that I'm talking about may be gone. You know, higher education is a very large battleship. It's very hard to turn, right? And people are still looking for credentials. So what are the lessons that we learn? So where you study is less important than what you study it. There are many, many, many paths into the middle class besides flagship universities. Fundamentally important. 2-year technical degrees, unbelievably productive, put you solidly in the middle class. Right, $50,000, $80,000, $100,000 jobs follow from technical degrees. And it's easy to find what a technical degree is. The zip code says technician, right? And boom, you get good wages, on average. So that's number. Certificates, again, highly valuable, highly concentrated. A certificate in early childhood education, worth nothing. Right? A scandal because we care so much about early childhood, but the wages are horrible. People with certificates or even AA degrees in early childhood education, 10 years after graduation, make less than high school graduates. So this is, you know, but there are certificates, there are associate degrees out there that are incredibly valuable, put people solidly in the middle class. We may not like them because we are all addicted to bachelor's degrees, you know, we're all addicted to high value name institutions, and maybe someone with an associate's degree in plumbing making more than I do is driving a Dodge Ram pickup truck instead of a Prius, and therefore is not like one of my friends. But the fact of the matter is that this puts people solidly in the middle class. Last point: in the state of Florida, they have a state-sanctioned apprenticeship program. The average first-year wage, students coming out with apprenticeship programs, higher than the average first-year wage of bachelor degrees. The most lucrative program in apprenticeship program, elevator mechanic. Average wage, first-year wage, over $90,000. Plumbing, apprenticeship in plumbing, $75,000. Millwork, $85,000. There are technical degrees that, again, we are all knowledge workers. We all think about these soft skills. Know how to fix an elevator. Make $95,000.
When you look at the data, at the data in both these examples, interesting things happen. But I wanted to next go to Matt and talk about somebody who's in the admissions game from probably. I guess I'm curious. What are you seeing? Are there any changes in the way consumers are behaving? Right, in the choices people are making? Are they starting to think about this major more? Do you think or?
I mean, I think major's always been a component, right? But I think there's a lot that goes into this. There's who are we talking about? What students are we talking about? Are we talking about traditional freshmen? Are we talking about transfer students? Are we talking about adult learners who need to come back and do degree completion? I think that if we're talking about traditional freshmen, which is what many institutions are trying to gather, many of them thinking about what we would consider net tuition revenues and how we're drawing students that help us pay the bills. They're thinking about many of those students who can afford to come to our institutions are thinking about things like rankings. So U.S. News and World Report plays a role. So as much as I'd love to say I have an amazing cyber security engineering program at Mason, there are not many students in California who know a lot about my cybersecurity engineering program, and likely because I hover in the 150 on the national rankings mark, right? So no matter how much we do in terms of this space, I don't think degree is always going to come out on top. Now, Within each of the markets, that's going to have some changes. So obviously, we play a different role. We have some very good institutions that we compete with within the Commonwealth of Virginia. You might have heard of them: University of Virginia, Virginia Tech. You know, these places have amazing degrees that we draw students away from because of those majors. But on a national scale, and particularly at an international scale, when we're thinking about these students, I really do think that the college, the namesake of the institution is going to draw as much as anything. Now, that changes depending, again, on this type of students we're talking about. Who are we trying to serve? Is it the students in our backyard, or is it the students that come at us nationally or internationally? So I think that's a key component to any of these discussions. And then I always think this question, does the amount that they make, now, does the bottom of the middle class or the top of the middle class matter? Does it matter that a student wants an art history degree rather than wanting an engineering degree? I can tell you very often, I have a ton of students come into my office and say, I want to be a doctor. I want to be an engineer. Now, are they making that choice, or are their parents telling them that's what they should be doing because that's where they'll know the jobs will be, or they know that they'll make the money? But the reality is many of those students won't be successful in those spaces. And so we have to be thinking about those discussions. And then I think the credentialing is an interesting conversation, particularly as we start to think about adult learners, the people who aren't completing degrees, and thinking about how do we get into a space where we are serving those individuals who likely have, many of them started a degree at some point but have dropped out and now have this amount that they've spent on a degree that they have nothing to show for it. So what are the institutions doing to help them? So again, I think that from my perspective, it's really about who we're talking to at the time.
And Marty, I wanted to ask from your kind of national research perspective, a couple questions, but one is, so far we have been talking about undergrads, the first institution people go to. How are things changing past that, graduate and beyond?
So I think when we're talking about value of credentials, we're really kind of talking about two different markets. I think we're talking about, in one case, and Matt was just referring to this, the people talking about going to their first institution. And I don't really think that's changed very much. I think that the race to get into the best institutions and to get your children into the best institutions, I just don't think it's changed. And I was one of those people who said more than 10 years, because I don't think it's going to really change very much. I've got a freshman in high school, and I know the pressure is increasing. And in high-performing Montgomery County, Maryland, where I live, he was already required to take the PSAT, so I already know what his score was. He's 14 years old. I mean, it's a lot of pressure, frankly, and I think that the effort, the pressure to get into those schools is just going to continue. I think that it isn't like there's a lot of institutions that are saying, we're dropping out of that admissions game, and we're really going to accept lesser students, and we're going to see how it all works out. I don't think that's really changing very much. Where I think it's really changing, and we're really talking about maybe 1/5 of college students. It's a very small sliver when we're talking about people coming in first-time undergraduate bachelor's degree candidates. The much larger growth, obviously, is among mid-career, later career students, people who are going for a second credential. That's changing dramatically, and I think that there is less emphasis going forward, and there's probably going to be less emphasis going forward for those students as to where they're going as opposed to what they're getting. I think what's happening is, we've got I was doing some research, we've got about 1,800 different college majors, at least that was the most recent figure that I saw. There's probably even more than that. Wow. But think about how many more specialized certificates, licenses, credentials,
nano degrees and micromasters. That's a growing area. That's why we're here, I guess. Yeah.
Exactly. And I think as people become more specialized in their careers, that those kind of micro degrees, those credentials that I can achieve that would allow me to get an additional license or certificate, that would allow me to make more money, perhaps allow me to get into a management position, perhaps allow me to get into a different industry, those are just going to become more and more important. And I think people are going to be looking much, much more at what's convenient, what's available, what's the price of getting it, how quickly I can get through. That's going to be a lot more of the decision point than what institution is offering it.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting one too, because when you think about, and what I'm hearing is a little bit of pushback in that, in other words, it still does matter what institution you go to if you can one of those
Right.
top tier and actually even probably a lot of the people at this table. So it's the question then of those, and then maybe even more so after that initial first degree, maybe it's not going to matter. Then maybe it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
But that first degree might be the point where maybe there's a little bit of rationale to putting a lot of eggs in like which institution.
But I just
Yeah.
to put numbers in perspective. I mean, we're talking about 5% of American students going to schools with the with the big name brands.
Sure.
And they just dominate so much of the discussion.
Of the
right?
media
And
as
you know,
well.
I mean, and part of the reason it dominates the discussion is because everybody in this room probably either went to one of these schools or desires desperately for their children to go to one of these schools. But if in fact most students go to either no-name regional state universities, or half of them go to community colleges, right? And I wonder how many people here like ever went to a community college. There are probably more attorneys in this room.
All right, we got one. We got it too. All right.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that Jeff Salingo was talking earlier this morning about going away to college, and I think that we still think about that because probably most of us in this room went away to college, and that for it to dramatically change, that sort of concept of college would have to drain out of society, and that's not draining out of society anytime soon.
So are we, I mean, I think the natural question, or at least for me, is, okay, let's say that since it does seem like, I would submit that there does seem to be a consumer preference to making sure a college student gets a job, right? There seems to be a lot of talk about that these days, not just the, we'll just trust that whatever happens at a four-year college is going to be beneficial and make them better citizens and all that. And so since people do seem to care about that metric, then what's the downside of having some of the data that we've actually been excited about in the panel so far, of having these American universities, kind of dig into how much money you might make if you do this decision of major or that national college measures? If we start to go there and have all this data, are you all worried at all that something is lost about people making decisions based on what they love? Or you mentioned already the parent wants you to be a doctor, but what about the human who has to submit through all that school, and then they may not succeed if they don't really want to be there? So how concerned are any of you on that score? Are we over bean counting on this money game of like salary?
Yes. Everybody goes, whew. Right? Yes, it is one measure, and it's a measure that we ignored for years. And why did it come into the conversation? Because the cost of attendance rose so much at our institutions, and the level of debt that students were taking on just made it, especially after people lost equity in their homes and couldn't borrow anymore, it just really exposed that weakness in the economic structure of our business. But it is an important factor. We just have to be careful not to overemphasize it or to let others do the same. It has to be used as one measure. And I would just encourage us to put in the context things like the Gallup-Purdue Index, which is still young in its work, but is looking at how alumni of institutions are doing in terms of measures and outcomes that aren't economic. They're looking at their well-being after 5 years.
Kind of happiness.
Yeah, happiness measure, a variety of things that reflect whether they are engaging as citizens after this education, this liberal education that is designed to make them informed citizens, right? So those are other places that we've also not been very good at measuring in the past, but that we need to communicate clearly. If you use those things together, if you look at, people don't access them very much, but NESI data for involving colleges, and you look at the students that have done well because there's good social and academic integration, those are pieces of the university experience that are not in the economic measure.
In other words, this NESI, measuring the academic, what's happening in classes, and how much people are learning, and how many papers they're writing, and all this stuff.
Yeah, what activities were you exposed to, did you engage in, and how did they affect your sense of the experience? How satisfying was it? But I would say that if you put the economic measures in some contexts that are useful, just a couple quick examples. There's the advice from the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau that students should not borrow more for their first degree than their average annual starting salary when they graduate. So if you can think about whether I want to major in this and look at the results and say, I can control how much debt I'm going to take on because I know it will be worth it and not go past that. That's a reasonable use of the data. Another reasonable use, there's a master's degree at Maryland, I won't call it out, that has 48 credits. And at $1,500 a credit for 48 credits, you will spend $75,000 for that degree. But your starting salary with a master's degree in that program is going to be about $25,000 less on average. So you need to think about whether or not you really love that major. It's a major that, a degree program that people do because of the love of it. But you can also use that as a force with the faculty who are requiring courses to say, do you really need 48 credits for that degree? Could you square that a little bit more with what people will be spending and earning when they get out, when they graduate, so it's appropriate in context?
I'm going to get other people in here, but I'm going to then open it up to y'all in a second, so be thinking of your question. Go ahead, please.
So, I obviously emphasize much more the economic returns, and we use Gallup data. If you go to any of our Launch My Career sites, we have ones now in Tennessee, in Texas, and Colorado. We report Gallup. They're part of our partners in this research. So let me tell you what we're trying to do now, and we're about to, by the summertime, we'll have this done. We're working with Burning Glass to identify the skills that get added to majors and what the economic returns of those added skills to majors are.
So in other words, we're diving deeper than even the major.
So you major, an example, psychology, one of the largest majors in any undergraduate institution and also one of the lowest paying ones. So what happens if you say, look, I know you're going to major in psychology, and you love psychology, and for whatever reason you're majoring in psychology, go to it. But if you major in core psychology, you have, in the state of Texas, you may have 40,000 jobs that you could compete for, and the average wage would be $32,000. If you add data analytics to that, right, you will increase the number of jobs you can compete by 50%, and you could get, $28,000 wage premium for getting this particular skill added to your psychology major. If you have HR skills, you may be able to compete for 20%. We're working on these numbers now. 20% more jobs and 25% more salary. So what we're trying to do is, for the large programs in every state, identify what the premium skills are that put you into the next level of competition, right? The next level of competitiveness in terms of the number of jobs and the wages. So I graduated with a liberal arts degree. Both my daughters went to Wesleyan, by the way, right? So there, I said, fine, go to the, name brand school. Thank God, you got into that school. You didn't get into Princeton. I hate you, but you can go to Wesleyan, and it's fine. But here's the thing. What you must take any skills-based course that is offered. Any statistics course, you must take that
deal,
course,
huh? Yeah.
right? And I don't care, you can major in God knows whatever they majored in, but as long as you walked out of there with skills, right? And they did fine, right? But so what I'm trying to do is generalize my parental guidance to thousands upon thousands upon thousands of people. Major what you love, get some skills that are marketable.
Well, I want to throw it open to questions. Here's one, and I see we have an awesome audience too here. So everyone, if I could give everyone's bio, I think there's a lot of experience to draw on. So please, would you introduce yourself to the?
Oh,
to
sure.
The
My name is Abram McAndrew, and I'm Assistant Vice Provost of Student Engagement at University of Arizona. And I appreciate the direction that this conversation went just now, because I was trying to reconcile the information you were sharing with, some institutional parameters, but also the fact that 80% of the employers who come to recruit at University of Arizona are recruiting any major, right? They're looking for skills. They don't care what a student has majored in. And so just trying to reconcile this, I feel that, I think that there's an interesting line of inquiry, and I wanted to get your thoughts on controlling for some other factors. You had mentioned at AU that the department's working with career services, right? It can make a difference, right? So the availability of career services, the geographical locations, right? How is that controlled for, and sort of these wage calculations? There's a study our Board of of Regents did, comparing, graduates from our 3 institutions and certain clusters of majors and how are they earning, that didn't take into account just the geographical distribution of wages within our state, right, that is concentrated in one area. And so just, I don't know if I really phrase that as a question, but it is a question about how else are we controlling for some of these things, and I really like this idea of how do we control for the skills, and when employers say they don't care about major, right?
Yeah, so I'll give an example of what we're doing at Mason, which is leveraging what we call an industry style career services. So industry model, meaning they don't care what your major is. They talk you through what your expectations are in terms of what you want to do with it, or do some exploration as to what you would do with a psychology degree, which for me, psychology and philosophy led to working enrollment. But I think that this idea that the major doesn't matter, it can work as long as we provide those kind of parameters within which they do that. So at Mason, we are kind of saying to them, if you want to work in government, let's identify what in government you want to do, and here are the types of courses we'll offer that might be electives that might fit within it. So there's also a blend with what we're doing with our advising model as well. So it's not just on the colleges, but also getting down to the level of advising to help them.
Yeah, I was going to say, also just to give some perspective to, the degree doesn't, or the major doesn't matter. I was thinking through, a little bit of this, and I was thinking, before the real explosion in college going rate, which really happened in the 1980s, in this country, we used to enter industries, and so you would train to enter an industry, and you would work most of your career in an industry. Now we're really training for an occupation, and that's really a major change in the way that we're approaching the workforce and how college ought to be preparing people for the workforce. So, on average, you get for people who get a degree, you're going to have 4 different jobs by the time you're 32. You might change industries more frequently, certainly than people did previously. And so, when you're thinking about what you're trying to emphasize in students, there is all the soft skills that we were talking about, but there's also just this broad-mindedness that just because you got a degree in journalism doesn't mean you're going to work in journalism your whole life. And there's nothing wrong with that. You have to be prepared for that ambiguity. And as I think about this issue, that's what I keep coming back to, is that really, that's what the workforce is going to be about. It's really going to be changing quite a bit, and people have to be ready to be making those changes throughout their working lives.
So relying on the communicators, the journalists, to help broaden this conversation and not reduce it, I just feel like that's really, really important, because this data, it's very hard for parents and students to use when it comes to them as a reduction to this major equals this much better benefit for you. So,
I think, oh, great.
Hi, I'm Alexandria Walton Radford from RTI International. I've been looking at high achievers and the degree to which what college they attend matters, and we've been finding that even among high school valedictorians, even controlling for SAT score, attending an elite college has this earnings advantage. But we also find that their undergraduate experiences really differ in terms of the academic rigor that maybe they're confronted with, and also their work experiences. So I'd be interested, Terry, if you could say a little bit more about what you're finding in the AU data about those internships, about those study abroads, and how that can maybe make up for a choice of a major that tends to be less lucrative.
Thank you. I think that we make an assumption. I don't know that we've ever run even simple correlations or crosstabs on employment with internship, or starting salary with number of internships, et cetera. But it does look like a very strong relationship between internships. Our students are taking internships at a very high rate. It's one of the things that's most known about the institution. And I think inherently under that, the notion of experiential learning, to apply what you've learned and start to learn about skills in the workplace that you're not getting in the classroom, or things that give you practice that make you more work ready than you otherwise might be. The study abroad piece, we just have a very strong belief in the notion of global perspective and experience with different cultures that's going to make you more attractive to organizations that are becoming more and more global in their work. So I can't give you data to back that up. I'd love to have you come do some research for us. But the assumption is inherently there, and that's why we present that data.
Can we get one more question in the back, actually? Sure.
Hi, I have a question, and it's not specifically for you, Mark, but I think it follows something that you had said earlier. So you are looking for skills that are on top of a major that is not traditionally seen as being highly lucrative, and looking for sort of the marginal return on that. Do you ever think, or how would you think that we could get to a point where it would just be a collection of the skills that would be what employers looked after, and not necessarily the degree itself?
Right. So, I mean, this goes back to the fundamental question, do majors matter, right? And so right now, we all know, and it's, you know, common knowledge, we talk about this all the time, that like the problem with majors is that in general, it doesn't certify very much, right? We don't know what skills people have. We don't know what they can do with a major. But there are, I mean, you know, the fact that they're not recruiting by majors or that majors are not important, systematically, there are differences in the wages paid to people in different majors, right? I mean, that is, you drill it to any level you want, go to any state nationally. So somewhere along the line, when they're saying, you know, we don't care what major is, they're paying radically different prices for graduates with different majors. And I think the reason, and maybe in 5 years or 10 years or never, it'll sort itself out, right? The reason is that right now what we're using is majors. Some majors are being used for surrogates for, you have the grit, the determination, you sat through, you know, a rigorous series of courses that you had to learn how to do something, right? It could have been math, it could be engineering, it could be computer science, it could be anything that looks like it's a cumulative, rigorous, economics actually, cumulative, rigorous set of courses as compared to, oh, you know, I took philosophy and I read, you know, Foucault or whatever, right? And no one knows what the hell you're talking about, right? So, so it could be, you know, so it could just be that right now majors could mark two things, right? Grit and determination, and like if you major in business, it may mark your willingness to like give up a lot of years of your life to study stuff that like says, I want to make money and I want to be in the business world, right? And therefore, I'll hire you, be easier than, you know, than a postmodernist. So what we're trying to do is say, yeah, like again, we're trying to identify the high value skills, value in terms of money, no question about that, that you could accumulate within the existing structure and then go to market with them.
Okay, I guess my question is, do you think that we'll actually need to go to college anymore if we refine our like marginal return on the skills?
So look, I mean, so I started earlier with the fact that, you know, we have a bachelor's addiction, which is like, it is absolutely crazy, right? So we can't, and in fact, one of the data points that no one mentioned so far is that, you know, there are right now more sub-baccalaureate degrees, just in the past few years, more sub-baccalaureate degrees being granted than bachelor's degree, right? So people are, you know, I mean, so again, in the thing about lifelong learning and continuous, like people are getting bachelor's degrees and go to community colleges, or they're going to get certificates or certifications, right? So so it's already the case that many students are skipping the bachelor's degree and trying to find pathways into careers that bypass colleges. So I believe, right? I believe that, you know, so I worked for the Department of Education when I ran NCS, and I had all these high-level meetings about measuring career and technical education. And this was started in 2004, and everybody said, in 5 years we'll get CTE right? 2005, in 5 years we'll get CTE right. Next year, give us 5 more years. When I left, give us 5 more years, right? So we have totally screwed the pooch on CTE, right? But we need to figure out how that really works, and in particular, we need to figure this out for low-income students, first-generation students who aren't going to get a bachelor's degree, who don't have the time, the inclination, the money, whatever, to get a bachelor's degree. But there are in fact skills. Fix an elevator that will put people into the middle class that has nothing to do with a bachelor's degree.
Yeah, I was going to say, so when places like Lumina Foundation, and they're one of our funders, so I don't want to insult them, but Lumina Foundation gives a 65% college goal. The former President Obama talked about having a higher goal for college attainment. We should be number one among our peer nations. I think what people hear in their heads is bachelor's degrees. And what we're going to reach a point where we're going to saturate the market with bachelor's degrees, because like Mark's saying, there's just a lot of people who don't have the motivation and don't have the desire to get a bachelor's degree. And if they don't have the desire, they probably shouldn't get one. But should they still be productive citizens? Should they still have good jobs? Absolutely. And so what we should be emphasizing for those people are sub-baccalaureate degrees. Are emphasizing apprenticeship programs, are emphasizing these technical degrees that might be more specific to their skill sets and to their motivations. And I find that what we're not doing enough of, I think, in this country is really emphasizing those kinds of programs and talking about those possibilities. And we're leaving a lot of people behind, primarily low-income people, who are not really getting into those career fields that they probably have the motivation and have the skill set to get into.
Well, I think we're pretty much out of time. I will say that I've learned. I feel like I should defend Foucault here as someone who took a lot of postmodern theory in classes in college, but maybe the data is against me. But I will say that we should all be probably right this minute. If we were really rational about how we're spending our time, we should probably be taking MOOCs on data science to improve add that to our skills and resumes. But it is an interesting time, and I think that what I'm hearing overall is that there isn't an easy answer to this degree payoff. It is going to be much more challenging for everybody in this space to explain these kinds of things. There's going to be more of this data out there, and the data can lead people astray. It can help people, and it can lead people to overvaluing different things. And it's also such a changing area. So we'll stay tuned, and thanks everybody, and let's thank our panelists.